Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, given the nature of this week's conversation, I don't want to give too much of my own life and my biography away in the introduction. Or we'll just say I had a really boring week and don't have much to go into. I did notice on Saturday that I had not started my car for a week, which can be a sign that I've been really busy, or I just have nowhere to go, or that I'm starting to retreat into myself because of a oncoming wave of anxiety or depression. I've noticed some weird behavior in the last couple of days, which I guess I should attribute to, next Monday's 6-month check-in at the oncologist. I've been telling myself since my annual physical last month, there's nothing to worry about, Gil. The blood work from the physical would have shown any big deviations from the last leukemia check-in in January. There's nothing you're going to be surprised with in July when you actually go back to the oncologist. But, it looks like my undermind is doing what it's best at, which is undermining me. But honestly, one of my past guests who's got the same condition as me, dormant, non-aggressive CLL, diagnosed just around the same age as me. He's had it for about 6 or 7 years now. He told me a few months ago the anxiety does not go away in that week to 10 days before the 6-month check-in. Even when you think it's gone, it's still there. So this is only my second check-in. So we'll see. And of course, I'll fill you in next week on how that went. Here I was saying I wasn't gonna talk about my life. Anyway, let's get on to this week's show. Now, my guest is Ruth Scurr, who has an amazing biography, Napoleon, A Life Told in Gardens and Shadows, just out from Live Right Books in North America this month. It came out in the UK last year. This is an amazing, compact history of Napoleon seen through a really imaginative lens, the gardens in his life and his relationship to nature. And she blows up the whole great man notion of Napoleon and history. And instead, she situates the general not just in his times or in, quote unquote, the world as we know it, but in the natural world. And what our understanding of the natural world was in that time, and what conflicts existed in those understandings, and what it all meant to him. And throughout his life, she finds the gardens and natural settings that marked his key moments, right up, including, she mentions the ones that bookend the beginning and end of his life, but also Waterloo was all determined by a walled garden where this battle went wrong. But anyway, the gardens throughout his life and what they meant to him and what they signified and how they corresponded or diverged from these key things. Again, this all might sound outlandish, but Ruth crafts a really flowing, compelling narrative using that device. And she captures the facts of Napoleon's rise and fall and his later rise and fall. And you could argue his early rise and fall with Egypt. And anyway, but she explores his relationship to nature, what is his motivations, or what motivations of his may have driven sort of pivotal decisions in his life as a soldier and officer and general and emperor and exile. And she does it all in about 300 pages. It is just a gorgeous, flowing book offering a new way of looking at Napoleon's life, but also of looking at life and how we relate to our times and the world around us. I absolutely love this book, and I am not a Napoleon or books about war aficionado. It's not like this is an alternative to all the other books I've read on Napoleon. This is brand new to me, but absolutely illuminating, so you ought to give it a read. Also, you really need to read Ruth's previous book, John Aubrey, My Own Life. That is a groundbreaking piece of work. And it got cited here a few months ago by Nicole Rudick when she was explaining her approach to her book on / by Nikki de Saint Phal. In Nicole's case, she was using Nikki's word paintings and letters to write an autobiography of Nikki's life. And there's a strong precursor for that in John Aubrey, My Own Life. Ruth explored the archives of, we'll say, an obscure biographer from 17th century England and managed to weave together a sort of autobiography from his own words using diaries, letters, and other sources. And that book is an absolutely masterly achievement. And I'm not only saying that because of the meta themes between me and Aubrey, although that is part of it. There is a sense from how she conveys his work of biography and the way he collected lives that I will admit resonate with what I do here on a weekly basis. And we talk about that a little, but there's something about that sense of recognizing yourself or the mission you've undertaken in someone from the past. But John Aubrey, My Own Life, even if I wasn't doing this podcast for the last 10 years, that book would still just wallop the hell out of me. It's absolutely amazing what she does with it. So anyway, go get Ruth's new book, Napoleon, A Life Told in Gardens and Shadows, from Live Right, and also pick up John Aubrey, My Own Life, which is from New York Review Books. In both of these, Ruth rearranges the whole notion of what biography can be. And she really brings her subjects and their times new life. Anyway, here's Ruth's bio from the book. Lecturer and fellow at Gonville and Caius College. I just mispronounced that, I'm sure. University of Cambridge. Ruth Scurr is a historian, writer, and literary critic. She is the author of the award-winning Fatal Purity, Robespierre and the French Revolution. She lives in Cambridge, United Kingdom. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Ruth Scurr. What drew you to Napoleon and to this aspect of Napoleon?
Well, I had wanted to write about Napoleon ever since I finished my book on Robespierre. Is the natural progression from
and that was my second question.
Okay. Well, that's the sequence, but I had a big gap in between the book on Robespierre and the book on Napoleon, and when I went off and did something completely different. So in many respects, it was a coming home. It was a coming back to France, to the revolution, to that story which I had left off with the terror. Napoleon is the person who takes that story forward into a period of empire. Some people would say he rescues what's left of the revolution after the terror. Others would say he closes the revolution. He's the end of the revolution. Those questions are endlessly debated. And so I wanted to go through the story and focus on him. However, I began thinking it would be interesting to do my portrait of him by looking at the ways in which he affected the people around him. So he's often compared to the sun. There's a kind of analogy with the Sun King, people talking about his dominating ego. And I was interested in trying to do what I thought of as a shadow biography, a sort of portrait of him through the shadows that he cast over a whole range of people around him, some of them known to history, some of them completely obscure. But then the problem became, well, that's fine. That's very interesting. But how do you choose who those people are going to be? What's your selection? What's your cast list going to be? And I really struggled with narrowing it down. And I kept coming back to this image I was fascinated by of him gardening on St. Helena at the end of his life. This man who'd had so much power, so much importance, ending his life with this small patch of land, trying to impose order on it. And then I went back to the beginning, and it was a magical process of finding one garden after another as I went through his life, looking with that lens and using that lens to decide who the people affected by him were going to be in the story.
And that sense of, I mean, you mentioned it in the introduction, that Charlotte Bronte notion that we all have only the idea of Napoleon we're capable of having. You know, that sense of, you know, biography not being a definitive project, but one that's reflecting the writer just along with the subject itself. Is that how does that play into deciding, you know, both the garden and the figures?
That's a very important idea to me. I really define myself against the idea of the definitive biography, the idea that you can't write about someone because there's already a large number of biographers who've trodden that ground, and what are you going to be contributing that's new? As I see that as a very territorial approach to someone else's life. And I think about the people in our own lives, the people we love, the people in our families. We all see them differently. We all have a different portrait to bring. So there is no reason why there shouldn't be infinite room for people to write about characters in the past, even if they have been extensively written about before. And I think as a biography, you can never really win, because if you say, look, I'm going to write this book about this well-known figure, Napoleon, people are, well, you know, why do we need another book about Napoleon? You know, but if you say, well, I'm going to write about this guy people have never heard of, you know, or lots of people haven't heard of, John Aubrey, for example, my second
I was going to say.
Exactly. And people are like, well, who? What? Why are you doing that? Surely if he was that important or that interesting, this would have been done before, right? So I think part of my understanding of what I'm doing as a biographer involves this openness to the idea that actually it's a relationship. The biographer and the subject, they both, in a sense, are bringing to that project something. And what I find in Napoleon that's interesting is not necessarily going to be what another person would find. And that's completely fine by me.
And I mean, a page before the Bronte comment, you also have Thomas Carlyle's "The history of the world is but the history of great men." Can you talk a little about the,
so,
and you bring it up, being a woman writing about Napoleon?
So the Bronte
also?
And the Carlyle are I deliberately put those in tension, as you noticed. And she wants to approach his life. She wants to get away from the pomp and the grandeur, and she's not approaching his life as a politician, as a grand practitioner of letters. Just, you know, this is the perspective of the ordinary person. And she has this fragment of the coffin that was used on St. Helena. So she feels, you know, a very visceral, very personal connection to him. Very respectful, but also with this, what I describe as the cold eye. She's got distance from it, you know, which is very, very interesting. It's a brilliant short essay that she wrote, and she wrote it, you know, to practice her French. An extraordinary person, an extraordinary writer. And Carlyle is the other extreme, really. I mean, he's a sort of gatekeeper in terms of who counts as a great man, who doesn't count as a great man. I have a huge amount of interest in what he achieved, and also some critical distance from it. So even he is pretty ambivalent on Napoleon, and I point this out in the introduction. I mean, on the one hand, he says, well, maybe he was the last ever of the great men, but on the other hand, he was like a gambler. He lost his last guinea and ended up with nothing. So he sees a varied portrait there as well. And obviously I had been in the past very influenced by and impressed by Carlyle's French Revolution, and when I was working on my Robespierre book, it was important to me. I see Carlyle primarily as a rhetorician, as a writer. So he definitely was somebody who I was thinking about in the way in which he had contributed really to the understanding, passing on the myths about Napoleon.
What really surprised you in the course of the research? And I guess as a subset of that, what was Napoleon to you at the outset? And how did that change over the course of researching and writing the book?
So I think what I would say really came through strongly for me is how multifaceted Napoleon is. I knew that before, and he's a very divisive figure. You have the pro and you have the anti. You have the people who, you cannot say too much in favor of him. You cannot praise him enough. He's kind of misunderstood, etc. He didn't actually start most of the wars that he participated in, all of that. And then on the other side, you have the real detractors, vilifiers. This was absolutely terrible for France, terrible for Europe, a callous, selfish, self-interested, egomaniac figure. So you've got these two camps, very, very divided. The same, by the way, is also true of Robespierre. So I'm attracted to these figures who are very divisive. And as I followed his life in the way in which I chose to do, so very oblique, looking for the quiet moments, the offbeat projects, the engagement with the natural world. What I found to be true is that, there are these different sides, there are these different Napoleons. He can't be reduced to one single, okay, he was great, or okay, he was a villain. That just doesn't work. My book was published to coincide with the bicentenary of his death. And around that time in 2021, there were a lot of online, we're still pretty much in the pandemic in May 2021. There are a lot of online lectures, celebrations, discussions. It was very interesting to me how many of them simply descended into the fors and againsts. It's so strong. Even if we started out by saying, well, obviously, we have to understand that, we don't necessarily have to take sides. People just do. 10 minutes into the seminar or the event, and they're attacking one another. They're like, no, actually, bottom line here is he was dreadful or something. So I think the achievement for me in my book is avoiding that partisan pressure to align myself with either of those camps. And the thing that meant, a lot of things meant a lot to me in the reception of the book. But one reader, very sensitive reader, said to me, the really fascinating thing is I still can't tell, do you like him or not by the end of the thing? That, to me, that is very powerful, because that shows that I managed to give that varied portrait with all those different openness, different aspects there. And actually, I think that's real. I think there are a great many people in my life and people I've worked on in the course of my work for whom that is also true, that you simply cannot reduce them to some kind of, goody or baddie matrix.
Yeah. Yeah, I did want to say it's a book that it feels as though you are suffused throughout it. There's almost no instance of the word I anywhere, but it feels personal without being subjective, without pushing a viewpoint. I mean, I'm over elaborating what your avid reader or smart reader said, but yeah, I had that sense of this is a person's book. Without it's telling Napoleon's story, but also conveying, a perspective. We'll
yeah, I like that a lot. I mean, that is what I try to. I mean, I think I say this on my website. I mean, do see biography as a form of portrait painting or portraiture, and it's a similar thing with say a photographer perhaps or a painter. You say, well, this is the subject is what dominates the frame, but it's coming from the perspective of the person who is taking the photograph or who's doing the painting. So it is that's what, going back to what I was saying about it being a relationship. And it has to, something has to happen between me and the material. Otherwise, it's not going to work. It's nothing's going to be made. I was looking, on your website, you have this quote from Janet Malcolm. The 41 false starts. Janet was someone who meant an enormous.
I'm always nervous when a biographer does reresearch about me. By the way,
well,
but go ahead,
this is not you. This is just on the.
Yeah, I know. My
the
mission
website.
statement.
The mission statement, exactly. I was like, I'll have a look, see who this guy is. But you have this great quote from her interview with the artist David Saleh. I think is that how you pronounce his name?
I think so. I always defer to other people with pronunciations because
Same.
I'm going to mangle at least one or two while we talk today.
Well, you know what? Also, I this is something I also feel very strongly about. Is I once read somewhere, I've forgotten where, you should never look down on someone for mispronouncing a word, because that meant they learnt it from reading rather than from hearing it, which I think is very, very strong. Anyway, on this quote that you have on your mission statement, from Janet, she asked him, why do you give all these interviews then? Presumably he'd been saying he was a very private person or something. And he said, well, because it's kind of like a lazy form of writing. I like making things, and so if I'm interviewed, I'm making something that didn't exist before, and it's a much easier way of doing it than in the studio or with the pen.
Yeah, no one's figured out yet that that's exactly my rationale for doing all of this, because it keeps me from actually having to commit things in written words. I can do it this way instead and say, oh, no, I created my grand work of art as a podcast. But yeah, that's.
Yeah.
That's not very interesting because it's just me and my boring life. But
no. You said just 1 second on that. My John Aubrey, my second biography, that he is basically an interviewer, right? He is a very, very early 17th century collector of other people's stories, other people's anecdotes. So I mean, he would have totally been a podcaster in this mode if he was alive now.
Well, I had the moment where I was replaying my Clive James episode to transcribe it for the zine that I started putting out. And I forgot that we had a moment where Clive totally got what I'm up to. Early on, he had oh no, I see exactly what your whole thing is, Gil. And I approve. He said, it's just you travel to these places, you bring your microphones and you sit down and you collect a little bit of somebody's life. And yeah, that's what I've closing in on 500 of these, which
fantastic
is filling me with some dread and trepidation. But I wanted to ask a Napoleon question that occurred to me. It's sort of a meta question, but one that I wondered if you had contemplated. Did he want to go to Rome? Was it like Henry IV with Jerusalem? Did he never? Did he actually want to go and never go, or was it something I think
so. I really think so.
He avoided.
Yeah, no, he didn't avoid it. He really did want to go. I mean, this is a frantic person. He's in motion. That's the other thing. I mean, the fact that I try to capture him in these gardens where these rare moments of stillness or reflection, contemplation in his life. Most of the time, he's in frenetic motion. He's one of those people who's sort of dictating as he's walking up the stairs. He's got, multitasking, all these different meetings, etc. And I think he very much wanted to go to Rome. He was very interested in the preparations that were going on there for him, and there were plans that were constantly being postponed and cancelled, and there's always some other call on his attention. And of course his mother ended up living in Rome, and the house in which she lived is a museum. I think there's no doubt that he would have loved to go to Rome.
Yeah, and that's one of the really fascinating aspects of your book to me is, I mean, it's I don't want to say compressed book, but about 300 pages. And it really conveys the brevity of Napoleon's career in a way. I mean, you have to lead over some of the big things that happen, but you realize how much life was crammed into so few years of having to do this, and then having these ideals in these gardens.
Absolutely. And that actually is something I'm also been attracted to in the past. The same is true of the French Revolution. We talk about the terror as though it sort of was a 15-year period, etc. We're talking months, weeks, within which there is so much happening. And the same, of course, with Napoleon. The rise and fall is incredibly fast, and it's a roller coaster. You're going to feel right once you're strapped in, once it's starting to happen, and obviously you know where it's ending. But the trajectory is just so dramatic.
Yeah, and putting that timeline in at the beginning, which things that I knew about in passing, but never really seeing it all laid out like that. That was I don't want to say breathtaking to begin with, but just seeing how many things are crammed into such a short period, and then seeing how it plays out for him, and how you manage to again create those anchor points in which
I'm really glad that you liked that. I mean, I've always got mixed feelings. Sometimes I think there's a little bit of me that's a sort of novelist monkey. I kind of think, do people really want a sort of 15-page chronology before they even get onto the writing? But I think, well, there's not much. But we had the debate, should we put it at the end? I think, well, no. What's the point of sticking it at the end? People won't even know it's there. So you've got to put it up front, just so. And my editor Jenny Uglow has just been such a incredible person to work with on all three of my books, and she would say, no, it's fine. People, they don't need to read it if they don't want to, but they know it's there. They know it's there whilst they're reading the book, and then they can come back to it. So I think she was completely right about that.
And that raises the editorial question, because I've recorded with a few biographers over the years. I'm always left wondering how you know when to stop. How many rabbit holes can one go down, and how difficult is it not to bring all of it into the book you're working on?
Very difficult indeed. And I think you have to learn that it's a principle of inclusion, not exclusion. I'm always telling my students this when they're writing anything, because when you're doing the research, there's always that sense, this could be really what I'm looking for. This could be really useful. This might be crucial to the argument, etc. So you amass all this information, and that's brilliant. But then when it comes to actually constructing something, it could be an argument, could be could be a paper, could be a whole book. Actually, there's not that much space. And therefore, you have to choose what's included, and it has to earn its place. And I remember learning this from Jenny Uglow with my first book, where for some reason I had gotten really fascinated by these two historians, Croker and Macaulay, who were having, an argument basically about Robespierre, etc. I got really fascinated. Wherever I went, I would be taking Croker's essays on the French Revolution with me. Just became obsessed with it. And so the beginning of that book, the introduction, had this whole thing with Croker and Macaulay going on. And Jenny was just like, Ruth, no, nobody else cares about Croker and Macaulay. They want to read a book about Robespierre. He's not, we can't even see him. We've got these historians, they're crowding out the stage. You have to refocus. It's got to be on him. And she taught me that sometimes the things that are deep to the fabric of the book and that have inspired the research and that continue to be important don't even necessarily make it into the final text. They're there because they've shaped the argument or they've shaped the journey that you've been on. They'll still be in the notes perhaps, or in the bibliography, but they're not necessarily going to have the spotlight attention that you would have thought they would have whilst you were doing the research.
Yeah, that's the wanting to cram everything in. I understand the impulse, and of course I'm too susceptible to that, which is why I'm incapable of actually writing. But that raises my mega question of your biography and your influences. You mentioned Jenny's tutelage, I guess, or at least editorial direction. But tell me how you became you. Where did biography begin for you?
Well, I did a PhD on the history of the ideas in the French Revolution, and I still really value the history of ideas approach, and I still teach it in my academic role. I love it. I'm fascinated by it. However, there came a point during the time I was doing my PhD when I suddenly realized the French Revolution could have been happening on Mars for all the difference it made to that approach, because it was all about theoretical structures and nothing about this happened on Monday and therefore on Wednesday and the following week and then 2 months later. And you didn't have a located sense of place or time or personality. None of those things mattered because it was all about ideas. And so I became really, curious about going back over the period I had been working on from that theoretical perspective, but really doing it on a day by day, week by week, in a particular place. And of course, Paris is fantastic for that because it's basically a walled city, that sense in the revolution that if the enemy forces came to the gates of Paris and to put down the revolution, they would succeed, absolutely would have succeeded. So their sense of paranoia and fear of being trapped, of the revolution dying and ending abruptly through conquest, all of that then kind of came flooding back in, personalities, smells, the city, the timeline. And I chose Robespierre because, he was always the villain from the people I was working on. They were the self-described liberal progressive theorists of modern society, people like the Abbé Sieyès, Condorcet, etc. Great people, liberals, wonderful. But he was always there like, oh my God, him, we could really, this is a nightmare. And so I got attracted to kind of crossing over and seeing things from his point of view.
And that brought you into biography for good?
Well, then something even more dramatic happened, which is I got to the end of writing that book, and everybody thought, oh, okay, well, so maybe she'll do Saint-Just next, or, perhaps she's going to do some other, revolutionary character. Or how about Madame de Staël, etc. No, I somehow...
That was a name I was going to mangle, by the way. Thank you for saying that first.
No. But then somehow, and this goes back to a conversation I had with Janet Malcolm the first time I ever met her. I had written, because I always wrote reviews of novels ever since I was an undergraduate. I've got, I don't know how many thousands of novels I have reviewed over that period of time. I just always did it as a student, and then I started doing for the TLS, and then I was doing in the Times, etc. Anyway, I had written a piece about A.S. Byatt's novel, The Biographer's Tale, that was published in the London Review of Books. And in that review, I had referred to John Aubrey and to the introduction to what was then really probably the best book about John Aubrey by Anthony Powell, also author of Dance to the Music of Time. And he had quoted Lytton Strachey and John Aubrey's differing approaches to biography, and I had quoted that in my review. And the very first time I met her and we had lunch, Janet said to me, she said, this John Aubrey who you quoted, very interesting. And it just must have stuck in my head. And
I'll derail my life for this.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
And I finished my book on Robespierre, and I was like, and now I'm going to write about John Aubrey. And my first husband, when I told him this, he had always been extremely supportive of my work and my writing, but he did actually think I had gone crazy. I mean, academics aren't meant to do that. You stick on your terrain. You don't go branching into a different century, a different country, whatnot. But I just really, really, really wanted to do it. And then, as though that wasn't bad enough, I then decided I was going to do it as this kind of invented diary, which is a sort of, unusual approach to say the least. And at that point, I was really alone because I didn't tell anybody. I didn't dare. It was hard enough to explain I was writing on Aubrey. To actually explain I was doing it as an invented diary would have been like a new level of insanity. So I just didn't tell anybody. And I waited until I'd done basically the whole thing, more or less. I think I'd done maybe 3/4. And then I sent it to Jenny. And then there was this silence for maybe, a week, 2 weeks, and I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do if she says, look, Ruth, nice try, but no, absolutely not. We're not doing this. But she didn't. She rang me up and she said, this is wonderful. I love this. This is going to be fine. And, it was. And that was, I don't think I realized at the time how many risks I was taking. I mean, it could have been a disaster if people would have said, what is, why would you do that? But somehow that form of giving him a voice when he, as we were saying earlier, he had done so much to give other people their voices and their stories. And you open any book, any biography, Milton, Harvey, Circulation of the Blood, anyone, almost anyone you can think of. And somewhere in the introduction, it will be say, as Aubrey says, like Thomas Hobbes, as Aubrey says. And as soon as you see those words, what follows just leaps off the page as completely wonderful. Yes, we do want to know what kind of hair Hobbes had. And if Aubrey didn't tell us, then we wouldn't know.
Right. Yeah, it's a phenomenal book, and trying to explain it to anyone, exactly as you were saying, it's one of those, you just have to start it and you'll understand what it is. And once you're inside it, it makes all the sense in the world, and the writing itself is so absolutely astonishing that it's gorgeous to read, and it creates, that question of, well, I'll put it this way. I recorded with Nicole Rudick a few months ago about her biography of Niki de Saint Phalle, which consists only of Niki's words themselves from her word paintings, letters, and other things. Essentially, your model, which she said she kept your John Aubrey book on her nightstand the entire process of making this book.
I found that so moving, and I was thrilled. I think if you have written something that goes on to inspire somebody else's creativity in that way, I mean, what could be better? And what are we doing anyway? I mean, it's just so great. And it also reminds me of when I did that book, and I would go and give talks and things. Quite often somebody in the audience would ask me this really kind of hilarious and brilliant question. They would say, "So, for your next book, will you also be doing that as an invented diary?" And I'd say, "No." Absolutely not. I did this because I wanted to do it for Aubrey, and then I would always say, however, if other people want to do that, if that makes sense to them, if they feel inspired, then that's fantastic, that's great. But I personally know I'll be doing something different.
And now I'm living in dread that someone is going to start sampling all of my podcasts and start picking out all my phrases and put together a strange biography of me after I'm gone. On the plus side, I'll be gone, but still, that's something to fear.
Yeah. Well, why would that be frightening? That would be great, right?
Probably because they'd figure out how often I repeat the same stories. But again, that's neither here nor there. I always tell people the upshot of sitting down with my guest for an hour or so is that I can seem charming, but they never really discover how shallow I truly am because we only get this little exposure to each other. But anyway, that's again, neither here nor there. My question for you is, how's your approach changed over the three books? Or is it really dependent on the subject? And, like you say, Aubrey, was a unique physician because of who he was and what he wrote. Or how has your understanding of biography changed?
I would say I didn't have an approach that's separate from the subject. And one of the things that takes me quite a long time when I'm becoming familiar with the material and I'm reading the letters, the diet, whatever there is figuring out what my approach is going to be. That's a lot of, it takes a lot of time, and it has to sort of emerge for me. And sometimes I try things one way, it doesn't quite work, and I try another way. So I don't have some kind of, I'm not conscious of having had like a free stand. I obviously have models in my head. There are books I really admire. There are writers I really admire. But I don't think I ever had an approach that was separate from the project that I was doing. And it kind of reminds me, actually, once I was in this, we were interviewing for the new Regis professor, and one of these would ask in the audience like the same question to each candidate to kind of get a sense. So we had these planted questions. So it's quite boring actually. We had to sit there all day and the same questions would be asked over and over again, and the candidates would give different replies. And one of the questions was, what is your methodological approach? And the best answer, the one I thought should have got elected, he turned around, he said, my methodological approach, I don't think I have one, like gasp in the room. And he said, except of course that I'm very, very careful. And I thought that was absolutely fantastic. That's me. That's yeah. I don't have
the Scurr doctrine.
Yeah. That's it. Yeah.
But do you have influences in biography, or are they more prose influences, regardless of whether it's biography, other historical topics, fiction, etc.?
So
who do you consider your influences besides Janet Malcolm? It seems.
Well, so I wouldn't say. I mean, Janet was a personal influence on me, and her skepticism about biography, about interviews, all of that, is very, very bracing. She's one of those people, in a sense, you sort of have to turn her voice off a little bit if you're going to write a biography, because she is so skeptical about it. She'd be there saying, I can see her now, like slightly raising her eyebrow, saying, why is it that you're actually interested in that? But obviously, there are great books that have had an influence. I mean, I think of obviously Jenny Uglow, because she's been so involved. But I mean, her wonderful range, her beautiful sensibility is very important to me. Hermione Lee is another person whose books I would say don't perhaps seem more conventional than mine, but actually I feel a huge resonance with her sensibility. I think she's absolutely fantastic contemporary biographer, certainly somebody I would think of. And then, there are other writers. So I always have a sort of companion for each book. So one of the things the magical things that happened for me with this Napoleon book was the response of Simon Sharma. And he is someone whose work I have always deeply admired, who I've known a lot. And when I was doing my Robespierre book, which, as he says in his review, came from a very different angle on the revolution to his, and much more, I was in my book much more sympathetic to or open to the sort of sense that the revolutionaries had a point, or what they weren't just sort of bloodthirsty maniacs, etc. But he, when I was writing that book, I had citizens on my desk. And sometimes I think, I found out something really interesting here. I'll just check and see if Simon noticed this. Every single time. Every single time Simon had noticed it. And not a single occasion did I thought, wow, the research.
I got one over on him.
And no way. Never. It was just incredible, the research there. So that was a huge influence. And then when I was writing my Aubrey book, Anthony Pole, because I mentioned previously, he had written this book, John Aubrey and His Friends, which is such a great title, and such a lovely book still. And I loved that book. And I went to the British Library to check in his archive to see if there was more information about Aubrey that he hadn't put into the book. And I found a letter from his American publisher, and they'd had lunch basically, and the American publisher was saying to him, dear Tony, brilliant, marvelous to see you for lunch. And he said, Aubrey in America, I'm not really sure, but that novel sequence you were mentioning, that could be very interesting. So he was
maybe give that a little.
Yeah, exactly. So I had that companionship, and then with the Napoleon book, there obviously there are amazing biographies. Very recently, Andrew Roberts was very important to me. Others, I would sort of be very conscious of what other people were doing with the material, and I think if you're allowing yourself to be free to approach it in your own way, that's kind of like companionable rather than a competitive thing. It's not, and yeah. I mean, there was one reviewer who basically, I'm not going to name him. I forgive him, right? But he I had reviewed his book, pretty gracious, very graciously, and then he reviewed mine, and he reviewed it basically with that slight sort of self-regarding panic. Has she spotted anything I didn't spot? And then he concluded no, and was hugely relieved. And that was the review, basically. there we
I
are.
like the doesn't break new ground, even though it's all about gardening. But yeah, that's.
He was just like, oh, okay. But he approached it as a competitor in the field. He was like, where does this leave me? Where do I stand?
So when you mentioned Hermione Lee just now, it got me wondering, you've done 3 biographies of historical figures. Would you consider contemporary biography, or is that, well, would you consider contemporary biography, regardless of who the subject is?
Yeah.
Is a living subject something you think is tackleable?
Yes, I do. I mean, I don't know what I'm going to do next. And it may not even be a biography, but certainly, I have sometimes thought, it would be wonderful to be asked to do some, living or recently living subject, to be given access to the archive, to be this, that, and the other. But then I worry that actually there's a kind of power relation involved in being the appointed biographer, isn't there? If the estate is behind you, then all of that stuff. So I don't know temperamentally how I would deal with those kinds of constraints.
It puts me in mind, obviously, the big story in the last couple of years has been the Philip Roth bio.
Yeah.
And the access, and then the scandal around the biographer.
Yeah.
And I just interviewed his literary biographer, Ira Nadel, his book came out simultaneously with Blake Bailey's. And it was an interesting read and a different perspective and a different conversation one could have. But Roth was sort of the figure I'd always wanted to get on the show once upon a time. He was a big literary influence on me in a weird way. But there was that sense of how much he wanted to control that image. He wanted to control what the biographer would say.
Oh, yeah.
He wanted somebody who would craft everything and kept things, tightly controlled in terms of who he should be talking to, what papers to divulge, etc. So yeah, I'd wondered if that versus the more open license you have, but the potential for elisions or just things you can't find with a historical figure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it does simplify things when it's no living relatives are going to or even the subject themselves are going to start complaining or putting pressure or withdrawing permissions to quote, etc. I mean, those are issues I've never had to deal with. I'm very grateful for that. I'm not saying I wouldn't if I was minded to do something and
Sure.
that was going to be an aspect, but I would be cautious, and I am a very free spirit, and I would be worried about being held to account or influenced, actually. But we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, we'll get you back on again when there's another biography. But the weird question, and you can tell me if it's too personal or weird otherwise, and we can cut this part completely. You mentioned first husband earlier. I always wonder about people who spend years and years on a single subject and how their spouses deal with that. How one keeps from saying, the funny thing I learned about Napoleon today was X. How difficult is it to segment your life and keep things, this is the study.
So yeah. I've had 2 husbands, and my second husband, my current husband, is a huge supporter of my writing, just as my first husband was. And the way that has always worked is I don't talk very much about what I'm doing, but I like to have a first reader. I like to have someone that I trust, very close to me, who I can show what I'm doing, and then talk about it once I've done it, as it were. So I sometimes talk to my husband about, something I'm struggling with a little bit. But or if I'm writing a review, I'll sometimes talk about it. And that process of talking will help me shape the ideas, and then I come to put them down on the page. And sometimes I'm just much more private, and I won't discuss it until I've tried it out on the page. But it's very important to me to have that as part of my personal life. And I, to be honest, can't really imagine having a very close personal relationship with someone who didn't engage with writing, not just my writing, but other people's writing, sharing that love of literature, of books, caring about it. Sometimes we'll, even if we're reading something and it has got some particularly kind of ghastly sentence, we'll show it to each other and go, oh God, it's like somebody putting their nails down a blackboard. Say, oh my God, how can someone do this? And that's a really important part of my life. I guess it's like people who are very, very musical. I'm not. I'm a completely passive appreciator of music. I don't play, and my understanding is pretty minimal. But I think for me, the kind of the sensitivity to beautiful writing, to economical, sparse prose and things, that is something that I definitely like to share in my intimate relationships.
Good. And I'm just glad it's not one of those, oh my God, she's on about Napoleon again. So I'm glad you're reserved about the research subject itself, but it's much more about sharing the writing as it goes. So.
Yeah, no, being alongside someone. My husband writes as well, and we share. You can go on these trips and say, well, what, we need to go find this museum because it's got this in it, and we need to see it. And having someone there as a sounding board, or sort of to travel, and I play that role too. I'm very happy to go on trips with him when he's thinking about his books, and that's kind of it's a joyful thing. It's like part of being part of that creative process.
Awesome. It puts me in mind of Robert Caro and Ina Caro working together on the
honestly, when you were saying
which
about,
raises
I was going to say, when you were saying about would I ever do a living subject, I would. I read Caro's work. I reviewed Caro's working, that short book he wrote about
the memoir.
His career and his life, and because I was doing that, sort of went back over quite a lot of those books, and just what a phenomenal contribution that has been. My review in the TLS ended up just basically being a fan letter, I'm afraid.
That's all anyone can do. It's why I've always wanted to record with him, but always felt that's what it would turn into. The why are you so awesome?
Yeah, exactly.
Sort of thing.
Yeah, I know.
But can you imagine that sort of project as a biographer? The scope of it and the we'll say the lifetime commitment of that sort of thing.
So I see him as he's got that investigative journalist side going on. It's a very, very strong. And I've never had that training. It's not been. I think I could get on the trail, as you so to speak. I certainly be very dogged about tracking down evidence if I thought that it was being concealed or something. But I think his writing comes from a very, very different life from mine. I just hugely admire the energy, the commitment, and the achievement, what's resulted from it.
Getting back to the Napoleon book itself and your sense of suffusing the entire thing, what sort of garden do you prefer?
Okay, there's two things there. There's in abstract and then in reality. So the kind of garden I prefer is obviously dependent upon where I happen to be having a garden and what is possible within that frame. So I mean, I personally, I'd say I was now on to my third garden, and they've all been very kind of precious to me and very different in possibilities. In theory, as in, do I prefer the English to the French style, which is such a dividing point between Josephine and Napoleon, you know, with him basically wanting straight lines and order, and her going for the, you know, the romantic vistas and picturesque features, etc. I would like to think I was more of a Josephine, but I'm actually pretty partial to a straight line myself. I notice. So I kind of I think I think it's a little bit like your question, you know, what kind of approach to biography do you have? I think I just sort of decide.
Oh no, it's exactly the same question.
Yeah.
Trust me, it's
I mean, you know, it's a negotiation between what's possible. I mean, so currently, my husband and I we have this house that is it's on the River Thames, and when I moved here, one of the first things I had done was these two deep herbaceous borders dug out and ready, and they just looked, you know, so inviting. It's going to be a blank canvas on which to start. And the next morning I woke up and the Thames had burst its bank and everything was completely underwater. I was like, right, okay. This is going to be a challenge. But in fact, lots of the neighbours said to me, oh, no, yeah, don't worry. The plant, they're fine. You know, underwater for 3 months, that's the problem. Underwater for 3 weeks, that's fine. It's good for them. And sure enough, it has been true.
There's that sense that the locals know better. You know, there's people who've been there, have the experience.
Exactly. Well, you look in what's growing in other people's gardens and you think, all right, okay, well, you know, that seems to work. And then you can't just have this theory, I am planting this regardless, you know, of the soil, the aspect, the whole, the climate. That's not going to work. I mean, it brings me to Napoleon right at the end of his life on St. Helena. Really, really wanted to have roses growing there. It's just too dry. You know, however much they were trying to water them, they're just not. And roses,
it ties to the very beginning with the mulberry trees.
The mulberry trees
and
the family, yes, on Corsica, exactly. There are some things.
I did read your book. Trust me.
No, exactly. This struggle to impose on, will on nature. You say, no, you know, we're going to have a mulberry nursery and it's going to be a success. Or we're having a rose garden and it's going to work. And not necessarily. And roses are, you know, pretty much like brambles. You know, I mean, they are strong plants and they're not that fussy, but they've got to have water.
No, trust me. I live basically in the woods in northern New Jersey, and my wife, when she moved in, had we'll have tomatoes, we'll have all this gardening, and didn't know just how pernicious the deer were going to be.
Yeah.
And so I always have to make sure I get my drawings in of the tiger lilies before the deer come by and just nosh like it's a big buffet for them. So. Yeah, there's you know, all that stuff to negotiate too. One of the things I was wondering about, you know, well, you said you have not decided what your next project is, but have you been doing any archival sort of research during the pandemic? And has that affected, you know, your practice as far as being able to actually get to materials?
No. So what happened is I actually finished the Napoleon book in the pandemic, the early pandemic. So basically, I got a phone call from my agent in March 20. So right at the start, and basically said, look, they really want to know, are you going to deliver this by the end of May or not? Because if not, it can't be advertised as coinciding with the bicentenary of his death. And for once in my life, because quite a lot of my teaching had been cancelled, I just thought, I have a clear run at this. I think I can I looked at how many chapters were left to write and how many months there were. And I thought, it's really tight, but I could just about do it. And so I said, yeah, I am. End of May, it'll be done. And then I really had to go into like a campaign mode, where, because it was lockdown, we had this very structured day. So we had breakfast at the same time. I wrote, and then we went for our hour walk that we were allowed to do. And then we came back, and then I would have a read through what I'd written, and then we would have supper, and then we'd start again the next day. And it was like that. And my husband had actually finished his book. So we had this heat wave, that thing. And he was sitting outside in the deck chair, reading Hilary Mantel's third volume. And I was inside literally on this treadmill of thinking, I've got to do this by the end of the day, end of the week, end of the month, etc., and then managed to hit that deadline. And at the time, I felt, really sorry for myself. I was like, why aren't I on a deck chair? But when you come out of a phase of writing like that, and I've had it a couple of other times in my life, you feel like, oh, that's where it happens. That's how it has to be. And I talked to Jenny Uglow about this after my first book, and you think, will I ever get back into that? Because life is so distracting. There's always so much going on, etc. Accepting invitations. But will I ever get back to that kind of focused, day in, day out regime, which allowed me to finish the book? As regards archives, so much was made available during the pandemic that it's been I already was using for years now the brilliant Gallica website when the Bibliothèque Nationale put so much online in order to help the regional libraries and universities in France, because they needed it. And that for years now has been such an amazing resource. You can download whole books that you would previously have had to be going over to the special collections to order them up, and other digitalizations of letters, of archives, of books. I think that the pandemic accelerated something fantastic in that regard.
So we'll see how it impacts going forward, that sense. I always have this trade-off of what you can do in person and, what can be done virtually, like doing this instead of sitting face to face.
Yeah.
It's a different thing.
Okay. So there is something very thrilling about holding Aubrey's papers in your hands. Although, when I used to do that, when I used to be in the Bodleian, and I'd be opening up the boxes and taking out the letters and things, sometimes I would just be so panicked because I would be like, oh. Yeah,
I was going to ask, how much trepidation did you have?
I mean, really. And some of them, and I would always say, some of those archives are really the Bodleian's a fantastic place for them to be, and they're looking after them, etc. But they still need sponsorship. They need people to say, I will give this money to preserve that manuscript, because it's such a job, it's such a responsibility. And there are times when I was thinking, yeah, okay, I'm a serious scholar and I'm writing about, but I'm not sure even I should actually be, allowed to be turning these pages like this way. With some of his watercolors, for example, or sometimes I turn over and he would have pressed a flower, it would still be there on the letter or in his journals and things. So a really extraordinary visceral experience of holding somebody's original handwritten documents in your hands, and I would always value that. But I think what the online resources allow, first of all, obviously, the dissemination and accessibility and inclusion, all of that. It also allows you to be much more efficient when you get into the archive, because you've kind of seen it virtually, and then you can go there and you can actually sort of see in real life what you've seen before and check for anything else. So I think the two, I don't think these are exclusive. I think they can be still valued alongside each other.
Yeah, along those lines, and it harkens back to Caro with one of his big moments of revelation about Johnson when he actually went down to the State House in Texas. Did you travel extensively for the Napoleon book? And how far did you travel?
Yeah, so my travel got cut
off
by the pandemic basically after Fontainebleau. So I had done what I needed to do, and I did Fontainebleau. I was there, and then next on my list was Elba. And I would have gone. I had booked to go, and I had booked to go and stay at the garden. Unbelievably, the gardener's cottage is the Airbnb or whatever it is you can book to stay in Waterloo. Should you? I ran into someone the other day who's telling me he was off to visit Hougoumont, and he was going to stay. And I said, I know where you're staying. You're staying in the gardener's cottage, right? It's like, how did you? It's like, yeah. So obviously, I would have gone there. I would have done that. But I'll still go there and do that. And St. Helena is another question. I mean,
that was my next question.
Yeah, I really want. I mean, I talked to Andrew Roberts about this, and he was like, "You have to go." And I was like, "Why?" And he was like, "Well, because then I'll know another person who's been to St. Helena." Okay, fine. But I would love to go. I will go. But when they opened up that new airport, and I thought, oh, great, this is going to be simple. Actually, even now it's not that simple, because those flights are constantly being cancelled, because not for the recent reason about, air traffic handling or baggage control, but because it's dangerous. Actually the wind and the landing the aircraft there is not very straightforward at all. So I reckon I might still go by boat if I go, when I go.
And last question, and I should have warned you this was coming. Who are you reading?
Who am I reading right now?
People hate drawing a blank on that one, so I apologize for not warning you in advance.
Not at all. Well, I am actually rereading Penelope Fitzgerald's The Blue Flower. The novel about Novalis that she wrote. The reason I'm doing that is I read Andrea Wolf's forthcoming book on the Jenner Circle, and I was reminded it's about this question of approaching material in different ways. So Andrea's book is fantastic. It's a group biography, Magnificent Rebels it's called, and when I was reading, I suddenly come to her chapter on Novalis, and I was like, oh gosh, I want to go back and see how Penelope Fitzgerald did this. She constructed that novel with the same material at the heart of it. So kind of looking in parallel at, Andrea's done a very accessible and beautiful group biography, but what Penelope Fitzgerald achieved with the same material, turning that into the novel, is also a different approach. It's very fascinating to me. So I'm reading that, and then I always have other things that I'm reviewing going. One of the things about my life is because I've done all this reviewing for so long, and I really value it. I just think I talk to other reviewers sometimes who think, actually, you sit there reading one of these novels and think, I can't believe I'm getting paid to do what I would want to do anyway. So, but the only downside of it is that there are very, very few occasions on which I get to actually choose what I'm reading, most of the time I'm not choosing. I'm just got a pile and I put them all in order and I go through them and I meet the deadlines. And then I get to the end of the year and I've read, things I'm really happy to have read, and then things go on to win prizes, etc. And then that, feel that without even trying, I've kind of kept up a bit with what's going on.
I feel, even though I said last question, I should ask this one too, because it's come up a couple of times obliquely at what you've said. Are you considering fiction also?
I really don't know.
Do you have a novel and or stories? Because you're giving me that impression-ish. And I'm not 100%.
I know. I mean, the thing is, I've just had this lifelong fascination with fiction. Whether that translates into actually producing any, I don't know. I mean, it hasn't so far. I don't feel under any particular pressure. Let's put it this way. I'm not one of those people who feels I must write a novel. I'm just very, very fascinated by different approaches to the same material and what you can do with that creatively. And another person I'm very interested in is Beryl Bainbridge, right? And what she wrote a novel called According to Queenie about Samuel Johnson. Again, Daisy Hay has recently, there are people who come at material from different angles and that interests me. But in terms of the actual genre of what I want to do next, I really don't know.
Okay. That's fine. I had just wondered whether it was yes, I have this novel I've been writing for the last, 15 years. That's 6,000 pages. And
I'm a very efficient writer. That would annoy me. I like, you were saying about short, but my book's quite short, 300 pages. That's quite short by the going rate on Napoleon. Most people who write about Napoleon are pushing 800 pages because, it kind of takes that before you've got it, etc. I like short books. And the reason that I like short books is I am a very slow reader. So I hear the words in my head, a bit like poetry. And I think for that reason, I'm always a bit daunted by, I've read plenty of extremely long books in my time and enjoyed them. Robert Caro, for example, is not short. Yeah. But if you said to me, what in terms of my personal aesthetic preferences, they are for short non-fiction books and slim novels. That's what I like.
I approve of both of those, even though I'm in the middle of Against the Day by Thomas Pynchon right now in my quote unquote spare time. Yeah, I don't know why. It was on my Kindle. I just started and now I'm 400 pages in and there's still 650 to go. So yeah, go figure. But, maybe I'll finish it by the time we get to talk next. So
fantastic.
We'll see.
Thank you.
But Ruth, thanks so much for coming on. I loved the book. I loved Aubrey also. And, I'm glad you're out there doing the good work.
Thank you. Thank you, Gil, so much. Great conversation.
And that was Ruth Scurr. Her new book is Napoleon, A Life Told in Gardens and Shadows, out in North America from Live Right Books. Like I said, I love this one, as well as John Aubrey, My Own Life, which came out a few years ago in the U.S. from New York Review Books. Give both of them a read. And check out Ruth's website, ruthscurr.co.uk, for a lot more of her writing and appearances. She's got links to an awful lot of her essays and literary criticism there. And that's ruthscurr.co.uk. She's also on Twitter as Scurr Ruth, all one word. I'll have links to both of those in the show and episode notes for this one, along with links to all of her books. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories show by telling other people about it. Tell them that there's this podcast coming out every week with really great conversations with really fascinating people. You can also help by telling me what you like and don't like about the show. Tell me who you think I should record with, what movie or TV show or book or music or biography or piece of theater or art exhibition you think I should turn listeners on to. And you can do that by sending me a postcard, letter, email, or leaving a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about me picking up and getting stuck in an awkward conversation. Messages can be up to 3 minutes long, and when you leave a message, tell me if it's okay to use that in an upcoming episode of the show. I would never do that without the speaker's permission, but if you've got something you want to share with the listeners, go ahead. In fact, I closing in on my 500th episode. You may listen to this after that one comes out, but I've got a lot of past guests calling in and giving little congratulatory messages through that number. I guess even if you weren't a past guest, if you want to say something for my upcoming 500th episode, leave a message on the Google Voice number, 973-869-9659. Now, if you've got money to spare, don't give it to me. I'm doing fine. My day job treats me well. My expenses for the show are pretty minimal. As far as, money goes, time is what this really entails. But anyway, help other people, help institutions in need. You can find individuals through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Topato Go, Crowdfunder, and other crowdfunding platforms. If you're looking for somewhere to start with institutions or foundations, I give to my local food bank. I give to the Poor People's Campaign. I make targeted political contributions. There are other things you can do. Freedom funds, abortion funds, Planned Parenthood. There are all sorts of things we can try to do to help build a better world. So I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.